I was asked to come here to talk with Lotsie about the issue of this public perception and communicating with the public and policymakers. As if you all didn't have enough challenges with your engineering and science systems, your permeabilities and porosities and your basin histories and your fluid flow, we're throwing another variable at you, and that's the variable of societal behavior and perception, which is a really tough thing to deal with. But as Lotsie emphasized, and I think I'll be repeating a number of his themes, but using the US experience a little bit more, it's a very important part to all of your projects. And I think in terms of what I called addressing the fear of the unknown, and again, as Lotsie said, the fear comes from not knowing and not understanding. That's the biggest source of those fears. If we can tackle those fears through education and engagement, the acceptance and success of your projects is going to be much greater. I'm not probably going to be telling you much that you don't know already. I think what I'm going to be doing is putting into a context, into a sort of framework that hopefully will give you some steps, some areas that you can tackle as you address your research, because this is a collective responsibility. I'm talking to the students, to the researchers, to the folks here from industry, from the labs, from the state and federal agencies. All of you, everybody has a responsibility in this area. I'll just give you about 20 seconds to read quickly through a couple of these headlines. I collected these. These are more recent headlines from the energy world. I'll be using some energy analogies, not just from geothermal, but from other places. So look at those for a couple of seconds, if you will. And what I'll do is point out that this wasn't a statistical sampling, this was just a sampling. I certainly didn't take some of the more spicy headlines. There are some out there that would probably not be fit for general public consumption, but you have some respected media outlets, if you will, Washington Post, UPI, NBC. You have some that are obviously locally based. It's quite a mix. And what you see also is a mix of the approach that media takes to energy projects, and obviously unconventional hydrocarbon development is easy to pick on because it's a flavor of the month, the year, if you will, but it serves as a good example. You have some that tend to play on this idea of the conflict because conflict sells papers, right? So you have water fights, you have friends and foes. Here, someone was very successful because they both angered environmentalists and annoyed industry. That's difficult to do in the same approach. You have the UK, who sounds like they had a choice between we'll take the bubonic plague or unconventional hydrocarbon development. So we'll choose unconventional hydrocarbon development. You have a couple of positive takes on this. You have a very factual statement, no emotive piece in that process, just the fact that the earthquake hit the geysers. And then you have here a very, whether it was a deliberate attempt or just an error in the understanding, would lead to complete misunderstanding of the situation in Ohio. As most of you would know, the earthquakes in Youngstown were caused by wastewater injection, not by hydraulic fracturing related to shale gas development. The water that they were disposing of came from hydraulic fracturing operations in Pennsylvania. But from this headline, no one would know that unless they went to read the article. And again, not saying if it was intentional or not, but that is the effect that you get. Many of you have experience in talking with the media. Many of you have long experience. Some of those experiences can be very good. Some of them can be mixed. You have some folks in the press who are very interested in what you do, and some have technical background and can be very, very good allies. You have others who want to be good allies and want to do a good story but don't have the technical background. You have others who simply have an angle they want to print, and regardless of what you say, that's what they're going to do. You don't always have control over that situation, but it's important to treat the media as part of that public. The public listens to the media, and policymakers listen to the media as well. So definitely do treat them as part of your public. So I'll talk about three main themes, and I only have 12 slides, so there are, I guess 9 left after this. So we'll be finishing up fairly quickly, and I hope generating enough fuel for some conversation that Lotsie and I would like to engage with you. The three main themes I'll discuss are the who and the what, the public and the policymakers, and the power of perception, because that's what we're discussing mostly here. What do they perceive, and how does that relate to the reality? The why energy research and development projects should be concerned about this. I think Lazia did an excellent job of showing why they should be concerned, because they can really shut you down. The last piece is the how, and how can we change this perception through education and engagement. And it's not a motherhood and apple pie story. It's a set of practical steps that everyone can take to some degree in addressing some of these issues. So with the who and the what, we're talking about public and policymakers and their perceptions and concerns. Just for convenience, I've divided the discussion into 4 pieces. You can slice this discussion any way you'd like, but it seemed convenient for this purpose to try to do it in this way. These are obviously not exclusive of one another. These aren't silos. There's a lot of overlap. There are some dependencies, but I think it'll help frame some of the topics. And those are costs, changes to the environment, hazards and risks, and impacts on the energy portfolio, if you will, the big picture. These are very similar to what Lazia also reviewed in his presentation. More specifically, what we'll be looking toward, thinking about the public and policymakers as your consumers and your funders. So they're there from beginning to end. If you don't have one, you can't get to the other, and vice versa. Changes to the environment. Kate mentioned this on the first day of our presentations, and a few of you others have brought up some of these topics. There are always going to be local issues, always, always, always. The global issues, things like climate change, very important, absolutely important, but very often they're not going to be your deal breakers. It's going to be your local issues that are going to be make or break for your projects, because that's where the public is going to get extremely involved, whatever side of the fence they sit on with regard to climate change. Hazards and risks for people and property. It's difficult enough to calculate the real hazards and risks based on the data that you have. Dealing with public perceptions can be very, very, very difficult. And it's that piece, this latter piece, that's something that, as Lazia outlined, that's something that we have to be cognizant of and have to address. And in the energy portfolio picture, this big picture situation, we're looking at issues of use, access, and convenience. People want to know, how does this apply to me? How can I use this technology? What's going to be the benefit for myself? And how does it fit into this larger picture of all of these things, all these energy technologies that contribute to my ability to turn on the lights? So looking at these in a little bit more detail, from the perspective of the policy makers, they're looking at how much will it cost to fund this research and development, and what's the return on investment. So what's the end game? How will I measure? How will you be able to tell me when this money that we've invested makes a good result? You're all doing that here at this conference as one piece of that. You're showing the results of your research that was funded in part by NSF, by DOE, and showing that evidence to folks like Rafaela and Doug and Dan and others. That's very important for them, because they take that information obviously back with them to Washington. And then they take it to the legislator, and Congress then gives them, or in this case, thinks about giving them the funding that they need to conduct these programs. So that's very important. Much more basic for the consumer, it's how much is this going to save? What's the effect on my pocketbook with this new energy development project? With regard to the environment, again, looking a bit more locally, you have the issues of aesthetics, noise, air quality, traffic landscapes, water quality and quantity, jobs, and the global climate. These environmental changes don't all have to be negative. You have the jobs piece in there, for example, so there are some positives. It's usually the negatives that tend to be in the news more often, but that's something, again, that can be addressed and in discussions and qualified discussions, looking at the balance of these. Hazards and risks, we're talking about damage to public health and safety and infrastructure. And in this case, there can be many, and obviously changes to the environment. Some of these could bleed into this hazard and risk area, but I'm going to focus my discussion primarily on induced seismicity, and we can put the water concerns in there as well. And finally, with the impacts on energy use, looking at use, access, and convenience. It's looking at how this technology fits into the larger portfolio of the United States. So I'm going to look at each of these in some detail using a couple of examples then, going to the why and the costs. And I'll switch gears a little bit and bring forward an example from the solar energy situation. So California, everyone would probably guess, is number one in total installed solar capacity and megawatt. Is there some way to affect the feedback, or should I drop this? Is there any difference in where I am? It's good? Okay. I'll stay here.
Where's the other mic?
But California is number one in total installed capacity and megawatt generation. I don't know if any of you in the room would have guessed that New Jersey is number 3 in total installed capacity, number 2 in the country in total generation megawatts. New Jersey. How did that happen? Well, there are a couple of things that came together for that to take place. New Jersey itself, the state, developed a solar renewable energy credit program. It's a little bit, it's a complicated program, but it was a way for the state utility authorities, the state utility companies, and the consumers to benefit from energy that was generated at the individual level, at the level of the home, that could be turned back into credits for the consumer. The credits were bought by the utility companies and help the utility companies meet their requirements for their renewable portfolio standard. So in terms of a market situation, it was very beneficial for the utility companies. They were forced to do it, but it was still beneficial for them. And the consumers benefited too. There was obviously also some input from the federal stimulus funds. Since the stimulus funds dropped off, the total number of installations has backed off just a little bit, but you have an awful lot of very, very happy homeowners in New Jersey because during the summer months, a lot of those folks are paying, during 1 or 2 of the summer months, $0 on their electricity bills each month. And that's significant in a state that I think is number 6 or number 7 in the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity. So you had a system that worked very well for them. This system of incentives, of credits, was unique to the state, but you also have a counterbalance. Lessons that were learned from Solyndra. Depending on which side of the aisle you fall on, again, Solyndra's story is rather complicated and tortuous, and we won't go into that here. But it caused the solar industry to get a knock on the head. They ended up being quite bruised from that. There were issues of the solar cells coming in from China, the simplicity and necessity of the government subsidies, and issues of cheap natural gas. But all aspects of incentives and subsidies and so forth, there can be some downsides to that as well. Changes to the environment, we'll take a page out of the playbook with California. This is California back in the day, in the early part of the 20th century. Oil rigs everywhere in the first part of the boom days. California now, that's an oil rig. Changes of culture, changes of environment, changes of approaches of people, better technologies, an acknowledgement that oil and gas is part of that part of Southern California, but finding ways to adjust to what the local population expects. What I did was to divide these changes to the environment into different categories. What I'm calling temporary issues, some persistent issues, and then permanent issues. Temporary issues might be things that you would experience during the development of the project. As the world has infrastructure, this new stuff that's coming into an area that hasn't had this sort of stuff before. New roads, there would be associated noise, new traffic, and so forth. Some of your areas with geothermal, obviously this isn't as great an issue because you're in areas where the population isn't as high, but nonetheless, these issues have to be tackled because someone is going to see something changing in an area where those things didn't exist before. And as Jim was saying, maybe it's part of that needs to be taken into account with regard to public education. The persistent issues are during the field lifetime. Again, those can be positive and negative, air quality, noise, traffic, and so forth. You also have issues of jobs and economic boosts to certain areas that may need that sort of input infusion. The permanent issues, legacy issues, reclamation and bonding, you don't want to be addressing those towards the end of life of a project. Those have to be brought in at the very early stages. Sometimes most of the time they're required by law. But if that's part of a collective process of discussion, it makes the end game a lot less painful because it's been part of the planning process. As they say, begin with the end in mind. Now look at why the hazards and risks, and I'll be looking at induced seismicity more particularly. But I'm going to start with an example from flooding with regard to how people look at hazard and risk. This is a picture from Colorado floods from last year, or from last month, sorry, a very devastating flooding that occurred. Some of you may know Cedar Rapids in Iowa experienced a very devastating 100-year flood in 1993. They also had a 500-year flood in 2008. The Colorado flooding was triggered by what they called a 1,000-year rainfall. Folks in Cedar Rapids said in 2008 when the river was rising, they said, gosh, it can't possibly go to a 100-year flood level. We just had one in 1993. And when they had the 500-year flood, the joke was, I sure don't feel like I'm 600 years old. Colorado flood, I was watching the news in the morning because our group, the Academy, deals with natural hazards, so I was trying to follow what was going on. In Colorado, I'm watching one of the morning news programs, Today Show or Good Morning America or something. And the main weather announcer, who sees millions and millions of people every day, communicates with them through this TV medium, said, gosh, yeah, this is a 100-year rainfall. Just think, folks, this kind of thing only happens once every 1,000 years. And I shouted at my TV, I said, no, Al, no, you can't be doing that. You're propagating misinformation to millions of people so they'll have a completely incorrect perception of what this risk actually is. What is a 100-year flood? It's 1% chance that that size of flood will occur in any given year. 500-year flood, 0.2% chance that a flood of that magnitude will occur or be exceeded in that year. In any given year, 1,000-year flood, 0.1% chance, etc. People don't understand risk, as Lotsie said. They need it put in terms that they can understand. For a 100-year flood, very good USGS fact sheet that I can point you to. Put it in terms of 30-year mortgage. For a 30-year mortgage, 100-year flood has a 26% chance of occurring at least once during the lifetime of that mortgage. Whoa. Your homeowner is going to say, whoa, 26% chance. That's big, 26% chance. That's a number they can grasp. That's a number that means something to them. So while this is perfectly statistically valid, it often means nothing to the average citizen. So we have to learn about communicating risk in a way that can be perceived by the public so they'll want to do something about it. Hazard and risk with regard to induced seismicity, it's the description and quantification of the hazard of the physical effects that could be generated. The physical effects in the case of induced seismicity, the earthquakes, the ground motion. The risk with induced seismicity is then the loss or damage that can occur as a result of that hazard. And we're talking about, this is really bad, sorry.
Away from it.
I'm still too close. Maybe we can do that. Sorry about this. That's much better. Okay. The risk, the losses or damage that could occur to humans or structures. If there are no structures and no humans, there is no risk with regard to induced seismicity. Getting back to this, Austin and Norm yesterday made an excellent job of explaining some of the vagaries of the data, some of the advances that have been made with the data that are collected around induced seismicity. With regard to calculating the hazard, you need a lot of statistical data in order to calculate the hazard of induced seismicity. We often don't have that in most areas simply because we don't have enough wells, don't have enough information in the subsurface. With the flood, they have stream gauges over the entire country. Our National Weather Service has excellent rain gauges, so they're able to calculate these things over a very long time period. We don't have quite the same database with regard to hazard and risk, but it doesn't mean that it can't be done. It certainly means that it should be done to some degree. And being honest and transparent about that is very important. Risk communication, risk management are just absolutely critical. So to the last piece here, impacts on energy use, what's in it for me? The first point I want to make here is that I think geothermal is undersold. It's compared to other renewables, but it's a base load resource like other fossil fuels. The public absolutely has no clue about that because they see it lumped in with renewables. They don't understand that. Geothermal is going to keep the lights on. Wind and solar, maybe, not so much. We're not sure. It's intermittent. I was curious because folks mentioned geothermal as a part of the overall energy pie, the renewables. So I went to the EIA database and pulled up some data for 2011. That was the most recent data that they had. I was actually quite surprised because biomass came out a very large proportion in terms of consumption by primary energy resource. And that's in BTUs. Geothermal is over here, solar, and you have wind and hydropower. If you had taken this back a number of years, say a decade, obviously this pie would look very different because wind and solar benefited from some of the stimulus funds. But geothermal hasn't changed so much, it's gone up just a little bit. So get back to my point, I think geothermal is undersold and I think there's something that can be done about that. Needs a common language, translating your 5 to 10 gigawatts, Rick, to how many cities and towns lights are going to stay on. So imagine, if you will, I didn't show Dave Blackwell's map once again because I think you all can remember it now. Imagine that placed on top of this. There are your areas. This is where your lights are going to be very important. This is where some of your big decisions are being made. It doesn't mean that we have to solve the transmission problem tomorrow. We have enough on our hands. Transmission has to be part of the discussion, but how does geothermal energy generated here help balance this overall energy portfolio so that there is realized benefit for the folks out here? That's a question that can be answered, and if you're treating geothermal as part of a larger package, maybe that's part of the solution. And then a way to capture some of your shorter term research and development goals may be to put it in part of this longer term picture. It gives you a context for that discussion when you're discussing with both your direct funders and also trying to communicate your messages to the public, why you have to do this research, how it fits into the larger picture. So this final piece of changing perception, I won't say too much that Lotsie hasn't already reviewed, but we'll talk about a little lesson from the geysers. Many of you know the geysers has had production since the 1960s, essentially. They had earthquakes measured there, local towns around the geysers. Since that time, it's very well monitored, as you'd imagine, because of its proximity to San Andreas. USGS monitoring facilities, also the state of California. So they were measuring earthquakes, folks were feeling earthquakes. In the very beginning, there was not total acceptance of the fact that these were human-induced. And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s, and in fact, when the current operator of the facility, Calpine, took over, that there's broader acceptance of the fact that these were induced earthquakes was actually part of the discussion. They get on the order of several hundred felt earthquakes a year. A couple of those, 3 to 4, something like that, over magnitude 4. Many of them in the magnitude 2 and 3 range. They don't cause extensive damage. They do cause cracks to plaster, cracks in masonry, and they're annoying. People are very annoyed. They wake up in the middle of the night with these things. As the discussions went on, the public said, yes, we appreciate you generate jobs. We appreciate that we benefit from the electricity here, but these are really, really annoying. Can you do something about this? What can we do? Through collaboration amongst the operators, state and federal authorities, local officials, and the public, they developed a seismic monitoring coalition, essentially. They meet regularly, discuss what the operations of the facility are going to be, how they're going to be injecting, where they're going to be injecting. They installed local seismometers so that local townspeople have real-time connection to the seismic activity. They're brought into these discussions, there are open hearings, or open public meetings, and they also established over time a way to recompense the public for these small damages. So they have a review board that looks at damage claims for cracks and things falling off shelves and so forth. So people get reimbursed. On my plaster cracked, it takes $4,000 to repair that. So it's these small incremental payments that are not detrimental to the company, and they are not lawsuit level payments that keep the public satisfied, and this has actually turned out to be a mutually satisfactory arrangement for all parties. In addition to these sorts of aspects of local engagement, as Jim also mentioned, they have a visitor center there that's also been part of this collaborative effort to gain acceptance for the activity in the area. Looking at the environmental issues, looking at best practice protocols, Austin brought this up yesterday. EGS, through collaboration between DOE and Lawrence Berkeley Labs, have developed a protocol for best practices for EGS that can be adapted to other industries. It's a locally based thing because your circumstances are going to be different in different states and different areas. So it's something, again, as part of the collective effort, can be very good aspect to engaging the public. And then finally, research and monitoring actually play into this because you're generating information that's useful to all of these processes. So without the lab field and modeling information, you can't go further anyway. So your work of the research community is actually also very, very important in this dialogue. Just highlight some of the key issues. Geothermal is undersold. Be realistic. I heard some really pessimistic things during the few days here. As scientists, you're ethically bound to be honest about your data. I totally support that. But there are ways to present it in a manner that also is optimistic in a realistic sense. So I just put that out there for you. Combine the science with an organized program of education and engagement. Start now. It's never too early. Get your elevator speech ready. If you happen to be in an elevator with the local mayor, what are the 3 things you're going to share with them? You're talking with someone in the general public in the supermarket line. What are the 3 most important things that you're going to share with them when they talk about the geothermal? If they don't know what it is, tell them what it is, why it's important, and what the time frame is. What are your 3 items? In periods with tightened funding, leverage your resources, especially through collaborations. Collaborations like this, Doug, Rafaela, others in the federal government, they're on your side, they're doing all they can, but they have a tough fight, as you saw. They do not control the purse strings. They offer what they think they need. They need help from other sides to get messages back to the policymakers, as Jim raised earlier this morning. And then finally, look at some of these incentives. There are some interesting programs out there, not necessarily just in geothermal, but in other areas that might apply to get a broader acceptance for geothermal energy projects from a broader swath of people. And then finally, what I'll do is just point you to a couple of resources. This report Austin mentioned yesterday from the National Research Council. Sid was on the committee that helped develop that report. Induced seismicity potential in energy technologies. It's a good basic foundational description of what induced seismicity is. So you might get some information out of that that could be useful for you. We also produced a YouTube video based on the report. If you don't want to read the report, you get most of the report in about 9 or 10 minutes. And then for some of you talking about other issues related to water, we also had a report a couple of years back on coal bed methane produced water, dealt mainly with the Western United States, a lot of issues with water law, how to dispose of water, how to manage produced water. It ties over with some of the issues that you may experience also in the geothermal world. And with that, I'll just put a few questions up that Vatsy and I discussed that might help stimulate some of the discussion whenever we do pick up the discussion after these couple of talks, because I understand there's another presentation after mine. So thanks very much for your attention.
There's a 3rd presentation. Who was that?
Didn't you say, Sid?
Not on the schedule.
Oh, it's another different thing, so.
Another different thing?
I just found out while you were talking, so.
Oh, okay. So,
How different is it?
Just in time processing.
In the multiple definitions of different, it's different in a good way.
Joe, it might be like have some questions first before.
Well, I'm wondering whether they have questions now
No,
for
they're
Vatsy
setting up.
and Elizabeth.
Sure.
So as a part of our NSF Sustainable Energy Pathways grant, I've been working with a Master's of Fine Arts student on his thesis on generating educational materials for renewable energy projects. And he's actually an animator, a computer animator who's done stuff for Pixar in the past. So I've got a 12-minute long video, computer animated video about geothermal energy in the context of wind, solar, fossil, climate, all these sorts of issues, a lot of which we've been talking about, that is intended for educational materials for more lay audiences. So I got added on at the last minute because of this this video.
Can we have the questions while it's fresh in everybody's mind, and see the video? And we can work on setting up the video. Jeff, would that work for you?
Yes.
Good plan. So, there's a question from Pat and then Stuart.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight something that Leslie said about there's this initial suspicion of companies from outside coming into local communities. In a previous day, I worked for Unical and working a concession application in El Salvador, and one of the requirements was to interact with the local community. And so we were initially greeted with a lot of skepticism and like, you're going to tell us what you want to tell us, we don't believe you. And so what we did is we organized a bus trip of all local interested parties to go from